Okay. Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. Thank you. Happy almost semi-quincentennial. And everybody knows that word now, right? My name is Marcia Eli, and I am so happy to be able to stand here and greet you on behalf of the team here at the Center for Brooklyn History, and all of our colleagues at the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are a part of, and the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight we welcome historian Edward J. Larson, chaired professor of history and law at Pepperdine University, whose many acclaimed works include the Pulitzer Prize winning account of the Scopes trial, Summer for the Gods, and the more recent study of liberty and slavery at the founding, American Inheritance. Professor Larson's newest book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters, takes us through the ideals, debates, and sacrifices that defined that pivotal year, tracing the remarkable transformation of American thought. At the start of 1776, few colonists dared to imagine breaking from Britain by year's end, or by year's end, independence had become the rallying cry. I am thrilled that this conversation will be led by Ben Tumin, creator of Skipped History, where he interviews leading U.S. historians. Ben also produces live performances that bring the past to life through satire and storytelling. His recent trilogy about the power broker at Caveat is a really good example. Ben's work has been profiled in the New York Times. So, following their conversation, we'll turn to you and your questions. Our ushers will bring the mic to you in your seats. Please just help us out by standing and keeping your questions as brief as possible. And Why 1776 Matters is, of course, for sale at the CBH shop. And Ed will sign copies at a table in the front following the program. So now, please help me welcome, and I'm so happy that you guys are both here. It's really an honor to host you here at the Center for Brooklyn History, Ed Larson and Ben Tumin.
Okay. Here we go. Hello.
Hello. Oh, nice. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Marcia, and thank you all for being here. Very excited to talk about Professor Larson, aka Ed's latest book. I've been reading Ed's work for a long time, or at least as I conceive of time, and it is such a thrill and an honor to be talking about his latest book today. So, I think to frame our conversation, the cover or the title of the book sort of gives you the general thrust, which is Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. And I think once you read the book, if you go through the book, Ed is very good at sort of slightly shifting your framework for understanding 1776, for understanding where battles took place, both literally but also quite metaphorically in people's minds. And I think maybe that should be where we start today. And I think maybe we'll go straight to the most transformative document in many ways. And I'm not talking about the Declaration of Independence. I'm talking about Common Sense by Thomas Paine. I wonder if you can give us a sense of common sense and also what sort of transformation you argue it brought out in much of the public in 1776.
Yeah, and thank you, by the way, for coming tonight. I've been on his program before. Tremendous. I recommend it. His podcast. I knew the year was coming up, the 250th anniversary. And we hear a lot about the spirit of 1776. It's amazing the context you hear about it. And you never hear about the spirit of 1775, or you never hear the 1777. And so I thought what I'd look at was try to study the year and why that year, does that year really make a difference? And it, in some ways, the opening chapter is launching a year of common sense. It's not that what happened in 1775 didn't matter. It did, for different reasons. Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, adopting the militia to make it the Continental Army, the Second Continental Congress, before that, the First Continental Congress, and before you can go all the way back. It all started with the Stamp Act. And you could add the Proclamation of 1763. So there was a long process that sort of sowed the seeds. But you asked me about common sense in particular. What happened is virtually no one openly supported independence, and most of them not even privately, if you work over their letters, whether it was your Adams or your Washington or even Thomas Paine before at the end of 1775. A lot of things had happened. The soil was, tilled. There was the environment was set, but by the end of 1776, virtually almost every patriot, except maybe John Dickinson, all supported independence, and most of the people in America that cared about such matters were committed to independence. And the transition begins, in a way, with three things happening in January. One was the King's speech from the throne in October, reached the colonies. And before that, if you look at any of the documents of 1775, take, for example, the Declaration. They adopted an army. They were going to fight. They sent Washington up from Philadelphia to lead the troops in Boston. 20,000 American soldiers, mostly the militia of the New England, were surrounding 4,000 British soldiers in Boston. This was open war. And Washington was sent up there to lead them. But when they issued the Declaration of Causes for taking up arms, it said, and I've got the words here just so I don't mispronounce it, "We are reduced to the alternative choosing between unconditional submission to the tyranny of Parliament or resistance by force." But then it added, "We have not raised armies with the ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain, but," and I'm quoting here, "but in defense of the freedoms of our birthrights as subjects of the King." Yes, they were fighting for liberty, but their liberty as British subjects of the King. And you have the Olive Branch Petition that says much the same things, pledges fidelity. They thought that it was Parliament. Taxation without representation was the problem. What they're going to realize, beginning in January, is the problem is authoritarian rule. It's the King. It's not Parliament. Parliament is just a symptom. And so they received the King's speech from the throne where he backs Parliament, declares the colonies in open rebellion, and says he's going to send over more troops, 34,000 troops, the largest foreign army in the history of Britain, plus 8,000 hired, he didn't give the number there, but it turned out to be 8,000 hired German mercenaries, and the largest navy in the history of the world. It was all in New York, and that navy was eventually all in New York Harbor by July, or by August, in July and August. June, July, and August, they came into New York Harbor. They used to joke, they said that you could walk from one side to the other, one side of Inner Harbor to the other on the ships. There were so many British ships there. On January, the King's speech reached the colonies and was published in newspapers. On January 1, the British troops in Chesapeake Bay bombed Norfolk, obliterating Norfolk, which was the second largest city in the American South, the key port for Virginia. Obliterated. They'd done it the year before to Falmouth, Massachusetts, but now they did, and Charleston, Massachusetts. But now they did it, and the news of that, the news of the King's speech, the news of what happened in Norfolk, and came out the same time, January 7th, of Common Sense, the publication of Common Sense. And what Common Sense does is, for the first time, puts all the pieces together. It becomes the best-selling pamphlet of that era, most influential political pamphlet in American history. Yes, the soil was ready for this. Yes, the timing of the king's speech and the news of the bombing of Falmouth, all the same week. People read this document and suddenly it all made sense. That the problem was authoritarian rule. The problem was a king. The problem was a monarch. The problem wasn't Parliament. It was the whole idea. Kings, as he writes, kings have laid the whole earth to desolation. The wars they bring. He has this wonderful line that becomes an American classic. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. And so he explains that the problem isn't Parliament. The problem is we can't look to the king to rein in Parliament, to be our protector. No, and then he gives a creation story very much like in John Locke's Thoughts on Government, where mankind was originally free and came together and formed societies to protect their lives, promote their happiness, and secure their liberties. And social contract sort of idea. And the only way to get that is a republic. To have a republic where the people are sovereign and where you have fairly, freely elected legislators making the decision. And for that, to achieve that, if we are committed to that ideal, no force in the world can defeat us. 88 pages analysis from beginning to end. It made what was happening understandable. And so when George Washington read it, and then he had it read to the troops surrounding Boston, George Washington said, the current military activity, the activities, the burning of Norfolk, things like that, coupled with the irrefutable logic of the pamphlet Common Sense, will bring everyone around that the only option is independence. So common sense plays, it's like the precipitate. If you have a solution already ready, it dropped that in, and suddenly, by reading it, and you can see similar words from virtually everyone in the Continental Congress. You can see them from Adams, John Adams, Abigail Adams. You can see it from Mercy Otis Warren. You can just see it percolate all over the country. Suddenly, they realized what the problem was and what the solution was.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It stuns me whenever I read about common sense, in particular in this book, and also having the pleasure of speaking with you about it. It stuns me the impact of one pamphlet. And I've talked to you some about this history before, and I asked, is there a parallel in U.S. history and then if I'm recalling our conversation correctly, I then did what I just did and said in world history in many ways, but then let's refocus on U.S. history. I've asked you if there's a parallel in terms of a transformative impact of a document that had sort of, it seems like it was pulling a hood off of people's eyes in a way. And your response was, I think the Gettysburg Address maybe something comparable.
I think, well, first I start from the idea that words matter, ideas matter. Now, what I do with the book is I show that I try to show, you'll judge whether I succeed, is that during 1776, ideas impacted actions, actions then impacted ideas. So words and deeds, they interact. And neither of them you can judge alone. But if I try to look, if your question is, yeah, I think there are other, I don't know if they'd be a pamphlet, but I think you look at something like the Gettysburg Address did steel the American people, the Northerners, to carry on the fight. It gave understanding to what this grisly war was all about and helped steel them through a lot of defeats, quite a few setbacks, to ultimate victory. But I think that you could name other things. I think Roosevelt's couple speeches by Roosevelt, both his For Freedom speech and his after Pearl Harbor, his speech to Congress after Pearl Harbor, profoundly impactful. So I think that words matter. Words matter a lot, but they can't exist in isolation. I would predict, this is something historians should never do, make up counterfactual history. But I think if Thomas Paine's pamphlet came out a year earlier, I don't think it'd have much impact. If it came out in January of 1775, it wouldn't have much impact. And maybe people were moving that way already. Franklin was already across the line. He had lived in England and he realized it was hopeless. They would never treat us. They would never give us our liberties and our rights. They would continually take them away. In a way, they were trying to preserve what they had, restore what they had. So I think it turns out that Thomas Paine's pamphlet crystallized a lot. And it doesn't matter whether the people are, whether they're moderate, whether they're left, whether they're lean right. It had incredible resonance. It resonated among Christians in New England, evangelical Christians that ruled New England. It resonated among secular Virginians. It resonated among, intellectuals who were children of the Enlightenment, as they used to say. It had resonance. It was read in coffee shops. I mean, the sales numbers are absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. The estimate was that half of all Americans had heard it within a few months.
Yes, I'm sure your publishers at Norton are wishing they had published Common Sense. Yeah, I think
it has never gone out of print.
Okay, well, there you go. I think, so in interviews, I will often, I can't help but read some of the text, so forgive me for reading some of your words to you, and to all of you. But one of your points here that in the book is that ideas, as you're saying, are maybe the central battlefield of 1776, although there are others, including ground that we're on now, that you can comment on. But you say, the fighting that occurred during 1776 mattered at the time mainly because it kept the Americans in the war. But battles fought at Saratoga and Yorktown in 1777 and 1781 brought American victory. What changed in 1776 was Americans' embrace of independence as the foundation for their freedom and as the war's goal.
Because some people have tried to write a military history of 1776. McCullum's book really does that. It's military history, and if you like military history, and I love military history, I advise reading Rich Atkinson. And he doesn't try to pick out that one year. The first year the British are coming is 1775 and 6, because the critical battles, early battles, were in 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those were profoundly important in weaning people from the idea that the British would ever be conciliatory masters, and ultimately that you could trust the king to protect your liberties. The final battles, as you mentioned, it's Saratoga that got the alliance with France, and Yorktown in Virginia that won the war. Those didn't happen in 1776. You do have the battle here, right where we're sitting, the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, if you want to call it, or the Battle of Long Island. But that was a overwhelming American defeat. That wasn't a victory. That was a defeat. And then across the East River there, the Battle of Fort Washington, which was located right where the bridge comes into Washington Heights, right at the Manhattan side of the bridge, where 2,000 plus American troops were captured and then ended up in prison halls right off of here. You could have seen them from the promenade. I think it's called the promenade, right over here. Prison hulks where they died in abysmal conditions. I mean, these were atrocities. They could only be categorized as outside the bounds of proper warfare. But those are defeats. There was, in the end, there was a small victory at Trenton that boosted American morale. But if you think about it, in 1775, yes, they evacuated the troops from Boston. And yes, they held on to Charleston. The British were stopped at Sullivan's Island. But the Americans lost New York and the whole lower Hudson Valley. They lost New Jersey. They lost Newport, Rhode Island, and they lost all of Canada. The army two armies that the Americans had sent up to Canada were pushed out. In some ways, the Canadians view this as their 250th anniversary because it was their 250th anniversary of their freedom from the United States when they kicked out the American army. So in the end, the Americans ended the war weaker than they did. But what had changed is partly through those defeats, but through all these ideas, is they gained a new purpose. The purpose was, and it wasn't just independence. Independence meant something to them. Countries peel off of other countries all the time. I mean, Rome had splintered off England. I mean, way back when. Countries were always dividing up. The Netherlands had split off the Spanish Empire. So simply becoming independent was nothing new. And yet, Tom Paine in Common Sense said the cause of America is in great measure the cause of the world. We have the power to begin the world anew. John Adams said similar things about when in the human history has people ever been able to write new constitutions for themselves? So it wasn't just independence. What independence meant, that we're getting rid of monarchical rule, authoritarian rule, and replacing it with republican, something brand new under the sun. The next year, the Congress adopted the motto of the United States. It's on the back of your $1 bill, and it's in Latin, but it's basically something new under the sun. They were creating popular sovereignty. As all the states wrote new constitutions in that year, they had had charters before. They're directed by Congress to come up with their own Republican constitutions. And the North Carolina Constitution was representative of the whole in 1776. Their opening line of the North Carolina Constitution is, all political power is vested in and derived from the people only. Now, you've got to realize how radical that was. Because in Europe, what does Louis XIV say? The state is me. You can read Shakespeare, and when you read Shakespeare's history, when they have one of the leaders, they didn't say Henry IV, they say England. They don't say, Philip III, they say Spain. The state is me over there. And to think that, and every one of these constitutions make the argument that the purpose of government, the end of government, as John Adams said in The Thoughts on Government, which became sort of the how-to manual for writing a state constitution, says the purpose is to create, the end of government is to secure liberty and security for the people and create the government that is most likely to create the maximum happiness for the people. Well, would George III ever say, or Louis XIV, or Christian II, IV in Denmark, that time was also an absolute leader, or Peter the Great ever said their purpose was to protect the liberty of the people, to promote the happiness of the people, to protect the security of the people? No, the state was for them. The state was for them. And as they argue, as Paine argues, as Adams argues, as Jefferson argues, as they all argue, Franklin argues, the avenue is the government most likely to do that. I love the way Paine put it. The goal of the government is the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. I love it. He was sort of a libertarian. But where monarchs, of course, wanted to take your money, this sort of sense, these constitutions written in 1776 were the first written constitutions in the history of the world. This was something new under the sun. That's why Paine could argue that the sun never shone on a cause of greater worth, that it is the concern of all mankind, all people, not just Americans. And that sense of purpose is what, because I look, as you know from reading the book, I look at what individual soldiers were writing back home. I look at what they were talking about. This spirit animated the whole effort. People were reading Common Sense. The soldiers were reading it. They were adopting this purpose. And that makes 1776, stand out.
Yeah, you're circling some different and important points here from the book, I think. One is the importance of these state constitutions, and how I think, as an important reminder, there was no unifying federal government in many ways. The federal constitution would come later on. So these state constitutions are really central to articulating or codifying a lot of the changes in ideas at the time. And that's, I think, one important addition to this scholarship that your book is making. A second point here is about sort of the skepticism of government. One of my favorite Paine quotes from the book is, or from Common Sense, which is, of course, in the book, is, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state, an intolerable one," which feels timely. And I think there's another thing here, there's another point here too, where this moment in time, the people, you're talking about Jefferson, you're talking about Adams, talking about Paine, and I should note that, as you've also mentioned, you go through the records of various people, and in Professor Larson's book, he's talking about all sorts of people in all of his books. But you do focus on some of the heavy hitters here, so to speak, and to sort of understand their framing also, you have described, when we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, for example, another famous document, which maybe we should talk about, you say that when Jefferson is writing, for example, that all men are created equal. Is that a Franklin line or Jefferson line?
No, that's Jefferson.
Yeah, okay.
Franklin liked it, but it was Jefferson.
Yeah. When he's writing that, you're saying that they are looking up when writing this statement, that they're looking up at aristocrats in England, for example. And that sort of frames what you or I or anybody might conceive of as some of the contradictions in the Declaration of Independence. Can you talk about that mindset some?
Sure, and as you know, I worked with that extensively in a broader sense, when I was doing American Inheritance, my prior book about liberty and slavery at the birth of a nation. Yes, you try to figure out what they're doing, because I really can't believe that Jefferson was just being a total hypocrite. So what was he thinking? And I think the grounds were set. The soil was set. This all was possible. This idea that we're going to have Republican governments. And what they would all say is, monarchy can never lead us. They're never going to worry about our liberty, security, and happiness. And which is the phrase, they'd all use those phrases. Monarchy's never going to lead that way. That's what they became convinced of. nobody had a republics were something new under the sun. Sure, there'd been sort of a republic in Rome, but it was an aristocratic republic. There was still sort of a republic in Venice, but it was an aristocratic republic. There wasn't anything like a popular republic. You had something in Switzerland that they didn't quite understand. But that's not the way the world was, not the way China was, that was not the way Germany was, that wasn't the way England. That was something new under the sun. Now, but they thought that if you could develop, and the trick was, that's why the constitutions were so important. The constitutions are all similar. They have a variety of ways they're designed, but they're all similar in that they have grievances against the king that deserve the reason why we cannot. And the Declaration of Independence is similar, has that, and they typically have a Bill of Rights, which is like. All people are, Massachusetts one said no, all people are, and the Pennsylvania one says all people are born equal. So a lot of them, the Virginia one says everyone in society is equal, which conveniently excludes enslaved people and Native Americans. But they're playing with that idea. So they're giving a Bill of Rights, a notion of rights that the government's supposed to do. They're giving the grievances of why it's right to get rid of the king. And then they set up a structure. And the structures differ, but the idea is, how can we make a safe democracy or a republic? They're republics, not democracies. How can we create that? Because you didn't really have a republic in England. The king and the House of Lords, were overbearing parts of the government. You certainly didn't have them in Europe. You didn't have them in China. You didn't have any place you could look for. And so they were playing with how to structure so you wouldn't have a tyranny of the majority, so you could have who should have voting rights. They differed. Some had generally universal adult male voting rights. Other ones, New Jersey added women. Property-owning women could vote. Nobody raised the property ownership. Some kept property ownership rights, certainly. They because they thought they would be needed that to be responsible. So you'd play with that. They all stressed we need free, fair, and frequent elections. They all said we've got to have frequent elections. We've got to go back to the people every year. They all had a weak legislature, but they so the people could elect their legislators every year based on what they'd done that year. Some go even further in that respect. I could go into the details, but they're playing with how to create a government that will protect the people. And the reason why, you never had much equality in England. There was a limited amount of land. It was all owned by the lords of the manor. They weren't called serfs, but they were tied to the land. They worked in the manor. You basically you're going to become whatever your father was, the oldest son. If you're a cobbler, you're going to be a cobbler. And if you're a lawyer, you're going to be a lawyer. And if you're a lord or a king, you're going to be the king. America was different because there was a frontier, because there was economic opportunity, and because it was the people who didn't have things in England who came over and made their wealth here. People were they perceived that in America you were perceived, because of the opportunity on the frontier and the land and the opened opportunity and the facts that the jobs were not all taken, that you could rise up to the level of your merit, so it'd be a meritocracy. They didn't see that anywhere else. So that's what they wanted. It was that experience and that sense which they would write, and they were thinking about, why is America different? Why are we the most literate people in the world? Well, because there was a purpose of learning. Why can people rise up where they can't rise up? Because there's a purpose. And what they didn't like, what they were thinking, therefore, with that idea, because Jefferson's phrase was accepted by the Continental Congress and was widely accepted. So what did they mean when they still were slavery wasn't abolished in any state that year. It begins to weaken in the North, in part in response. Pennsylvania soon passes an abolitionist statute, and Massachusetts, by court order, gets rid of slavery within a couple of years in reaction to all this movement. But they were England was trying to lord it over them. And in England, you were automatically, the Magna Carta yeah, they say the king's under law in a way, but a king has Magna Carta. The king has certain rights. The barons have other rights. Free citizens have other rights. The serfs would have other rights. Everyone was sort of layered. And they're saying, no, we can all rise up. We have. Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, they'd started with nothing and they'd become something, or their parents had. And so we don't want anybody, there's nobody above us. And I think when they said all men are created equal, they were thinking that people weren't created as owners of the manor. They weren't created as aristocrats. They weren't created as the lords over them. And we don't want England, which was trying to claim power over them, taking away their rights. We reject that. All men are created equal. So I think they were mostly looking up, that nobody was automatically their superior. We can rise to our level of ability. They weren't looking down to people who was below them. That took time.
In the book, you're reminding me of the of a diverse group of people who you write as being inspired by the Declaration of Independence in the intervening years. So you mentioned in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who began her Declaration of Sentiments issued at Seneca Falls. This is for women's rights, paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. You mentioned Frederick Douglass in his famous speech in 1852, "What's the slave is the 4th of July." You talk about Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano, FDR, JFK, MLK, just to get some quick acronyms out of the way, and also Ronald Reagan citing it too. And it's clearly, we're all familiar with it. If you're unfamiliar with the Declaration of Independence, quite a seminal document from 1776. And I'm wondering, what is in your mind as you've studied it, as you're studying these sentiments and what changed in 1776, among that diverse group of people, what is it that you see that is joining them together and drawing inspiration from the document?
Well, I think in a way, Jefferson was drawn into, he's given the job of writing the Declaration of Independence. And as Adams would sort of sneer, it was an afternoon's job. It didn't take long because you're drawing, and Jefferson sat back. Well, it took me a little longer than that, but they didn't ask me to write anything original. I was supposed to create a document that Congress would buy. So I drew on what was already written. He drew on his own pamphlets. He drew on Adams's writing. He drew on Mason's work in Virginia. He drew on the state constitutions. You can see where he's pulling almost every piece together. And yes, it's a composite work. I compare it to a beautiful Virginia quilt. He so beautifully puts it together. But I think you're driven to the idea, if you think that government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, if you think that this is a Republican government, if you think this is a popular government, if you believe that the purpose of government is to protect liberty and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of the individual, well, you're almost inevitably forced to believe that all men are created equal. That is, they can rise to different levels. You could believe in a meritocracy, but that there's a fundamental equality. You almost have to start with that. Well, this was Franklin words, as a self-evident right, as self-evident. Jefferson had written sacred, but Franklin said, no, this is self-evident. It's funny because these concepts of all created equal, these concepts, the purpose of government is that you have inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That wasn't true anywhere in the world at that time. There was no history of those things. And yet Franklin says, and Congress buys that these are self-evident. Now, I think you're driven to posit, if you're going to have a government where the people rule through their elected representatives who are supposed to represent them, and you have broad voting rights, well, you're inevitably driven to that these people are in some fundamental way for politics equal. And so you're forced in the logic of the argument to put that in. Most of the state constitutions sort of echo this in one way or the other. As I said, some of them go further and say all men are born free, and those states that do that very quickly abolish slavery: Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. But some concept of the equality of at least the electorate, of the ruling of the people in control, which is most of the people in these states, or most of the men. Usually, virtually all the adult white males, adult free males. It depends on the state exactly how they define their electorate, but you've got to believe in some sort of form of equality. Now, that's what becomes inspirational. The people he was referring to, he said, Frederick Douglass, in this famous "What is the 4th of July for an enslaved person," said, that while I reject the 4th of July, the sentiments expressed, if people took them seriously, the sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that is a fundamental sentiment that animates everything I'm doing. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton here in New York made similar thoughts. And so when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, which was then known as the Nebraska Act, which opened slavery in the parts of America that had been previously closed to slavery by the Missouri Compromise, Lincoln says that the Nebraska Act and the spirit of 1776 are utter antagonists. That is, they're in total opposition with each other. And so those ideas in the Declaration of Independence, as they sort of sink into the American consciousness, and this document that, Adams didn't think would be very important, becomes the most, I would argue, that sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," that goes on for a bit after that. That sentence was probably the most important sentence in American history. And if people try to think, what is the American dream? The American dream has somehow became tied up with the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the American dream. That's what has lived through the years. And it doesn't matter what you could say, politician after politician looks back at those founding words, and they have become the animating spirit of America. Now, it wasn't that Jefferson was borrowing from others. The word happiness as a goal of government, that appears in Adams' Thoughts on Government, it appears in Common Sense, it appears in and protecting security and protecting liberty. Those appear in all the documents before. It just gets pulled together really beautifully by Jefferson. And I do think that idea has continued to animate the Americans and the American dream ever since.
Yeah, it strikes me as you're talking, it's the Declaration of Independence, not to diminish it, but it strikes me almost as it's a very aspirational document, versus something like the Constitution, which is laying out government. So the Declaration of Independence is more like a mission statement for the next 249 years and unfolding. And I do want to echo that some of these state constitutions that are being formed in the 1776 are quite. Some are much more conservative. Some are quite radical. The Pennsylvania Constitution that you've mentioned a few times almost included something like the right to prevent people from owning too much property. It's very close to stating basically a statement, a right against wealth accumulation, or extreme wealth accumulation. And
they include term limits. They include provisions that you could only read as anti-gerrymandering, that you end up having to have your legislature should be broadly representative of the people. All these provisions, because there weren't any Republican governments. They had to invent them. They had to invent checks and balances. They had to and they were all working in the middle of a war, because Congress had passed a resolution in March directing all the states because everyone was under a charter from the king. So every state, every colony was under a royal charter, or a charter to a proprietor. same difference. And all of these had the people electing, sort of a modeled on the House of Commons, a limited electorate picking an assembly, and then an appointed upper house or Senate or council or whatever they called. Bills had to pass both. And then there was some sort of a royally appointed or proprietarily appointed governor, all modeled on the king. And then every law had to go to the king for final approval or veto. So the governors, the royally appointed governors could veto it. The equivalent of the House of Lords, which were appointed major landowners in the area, they had to approve it. There was very little that was democratic in the system. And they threw them out, and they created these new governments where the people dominated every branch, usually with a weak governor, but the people would choose the lower house. They'd often choose the upper house too, or the lower house would choose the upper house. The legislators, it wouldn't be the king that chose judges. They would choose judges, and the governor would usually be chosen by the legislature, usually by the lower house. Again, 1-year terms, term limits were very typical. Bills, some of them had phrases that the bills, unlike the big beautiful bill, they could only deal with one concept. They would have to be published so everybody could read them. They had to have a title that say what was in them. And then the legislature, so the people, and they'd be published, unlike in England, so the people could be involved, and then they would have an election that year, and they could hold their legislators responsible. They were working on the fly, and they were really quite creative, and some were certainly more radical, some had more checks and balances in them, but they were all popular democracies. And when you think of them doing this on the fly in the middle of a war, it's pretty darn impressive. So I love the word that Thomas Jefferson said. Jefferson, he worked on the new Constitution in Virginia, and he said, in truth, referring to the Constitution, in truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy. For should a bad government be instituted for us in future, it would have been as well to have accepted the first bad one that had been offered to us from beyond the water without the risk and the expense of a contest. So he's saying, not the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of Virginia. This is what it's all about. And Adams, in his Thoughts on Government, when had a people full power and fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. And he added, republics are governments of law, not men. That's why constitutions mattered. We're a government of law because that's what they realized. You can never trust a king. You can never trust an authoritarian government. That is the problem. Taxation representation is a symptom of the underlying problem. So that was the realization, and these people are all captured in the spirit, and you can read it all the way down to the foot soldiers in the field. This is what they captured. You had mentioned to me before we came out here, years later, you mentioned this quote to me, and it reminded me of it. Years later, John Adams, long after he was no longer president, he lived forever, and Jefferson, long after he was no longer president, Adams writes to Jefferson, and he writes, what was the revolution? I think I get this pretty close. What was the revolution? And then he answers his own question. Adams always answered all his own questions. He says, it wasn't the war. The war was just a consequence or an effect of the revolution. The revolution was in the minds of the people.
Almost spot on with the quote. Yeah, that's exactly where I was turning to here. And as you say, he found evidence of that revolution in, quote, the records of the 13 legislatures, the pamphlets, and newspapers in all the colonies. Okay, I think we are just about ready to hand it over to the audience for some questions, if y'all have any questions. Please.
1 second.
Yep.
Yeah. It's always mind-boggled me that the irrational exuberance of success against England, right? I mean, like, it still shocks everyone in many ways.
Yeah, you mean how exuberant, how they thought they'd win? Yeah, I mean, Thomas Paine covers everything in Common Sense. It's an amazing 88 pages. But he gets to a point where, because he anticipates all the objections, and he has this exuberance. We can't lose. We're fighting for this idea, and they can send over all the troops they want to. We can't lose. And the exuberance was absolutely, and the British, I mean, it was the largest army they'd ever assembled. George III broke the bank. Ships, the largest foreign vessels, he commandeered ships, he added ships. He was also the leader of some states in Germany, because that's how, kings were. They were born and they ruled. He had 2 or 3 that he was leader of. And so he sweeps up all their armies and brings them over. And the Americans were just going to wait it out. Washington figured, what the problem was, Washington tried to fight to defend New York, and it was indefensible against the Navy, because the Americans had no Navy, and the British virtually no Navy. John Paul Jones floating around, but the British had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships, all loaded with cannons, and so you're not going to defend New York, and yet he tried to. And what he learned is, I can't do it. Retreat, strategic retreats. He becomes called America's Fabian. Fabian was a general in ancient Rome who kept retreating against Hannibal and basically wore Hannibal out, because they realized that the people were on their side. So, because they had adopted these ideas. So you couldn't crush them. So the British would move, and as long as Washington's army didn't get destroyed, as it was captured in Fort Washington, that's why it was such a mistake, as long as after the Battle of White Plains you retreat, then you pull out and you keep fleeing back across New Jersey all the way across to Pennsylvania. As long as the army doesn't get defeated, well, the British can't be everywhere. And once they pull out of an area, the Patriots just come right back in, because the people are against the British. And as long as the people are against the British, as soon as the army leaves, it'll go back into Patriot hands. And that becomes the war of attrition strategy that I guess America saw used against us in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and other places. Unless you win over the hearts and the minds of the people, you can't win in a battle like that. And that's what Washington realized, and he realized it right here when he fled from Brooklyn Heights on that night and got his troops back to Manhattan, and then kept moving up Manhattan and pulling out everybody but at Fort Washington. And then Fort Washington taught him, yeah, I got to keep doing this. So yes, that happened in 1776. So Brooklyn Heights was part of it. Sorry education, but an education nonetheless.
So here in Brooklyn, Washington gets really lucky with the weather that night, or the couple of days when he's trying to pull out.
He thought it was divine intervention.
Right. So with that being said, how much does luck play in 1776? You talked about earlier about common sense, and how if that was published a year earlier, then they probably wouldn't have turned the tide of the war and gotten people behind them. How much does luck come to play in 1776?
Well, I think it's not luck. I think luck probably is a factor. But what I tend to draw from 1776 is contingency. That individual actions, individual words do matter. That you can make a difference. That ideas can make a difference. That Thomas Paine, he was never Tom, Thomas Paine. I checked this out because one of his biographers calls his book Tom Paine. It's a good book otherwise. Calls his book Tom Paine and always refers to him as Tom Paine. But others, Thomas. And so I looked at all the letters to and from him. It's always Thomas. all the things he wrote, it's always Thomas or anonymous. It's just like, it's never Sam Adams, it's always Samuel Adams. It's never Ben Franklin, it's always Benjamin, or B-E-N-J, period, Benjamin. So Thomas Paine, the fact that he wrote it served as a powerful precipitant. The fact that John Adams wrote Thoughts on Government was critical for shaping half the state constitutions. The way that Franklin was chair of the convention that wrote the Pennsylvania Constitution, the way he wrote that, or the way he put in self-evident, the way Jefferson pulled together the Declaration of Independence, or George Mason pulled together, those things make a difference. Individual soldiers, Henry Knox, whatever he was at that time, low rank, he becomes a general, but not now, thinks of the idea of grabbing the cannons at Ticonderoga in New York and pulling them over the snow, over the hills, the Berkshires, and driving the British out. And that was just his idea. And Washington says, well, might as well try. Here's $100. And a note saying all the soldiers have to help you. And you're on your own. He took his brother. He was like 24. And his brother was like 18. And they go off and they bring the cannons in and they liberate Boston. So contingency matters. You don't know. Ahead of time, you don't know. You can't predict what's going to be the thing that makes a difference, but individual things. Ben's podcast could make a fundamental difference. It depends on who reads it and when it goes off. All
slow
these
down
things
there. Yeah.
can make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's what you see in 1776. A lot of individual contingency playing out. And part of it's the right time and the right place, which is what I think makes the luck provision. But I think if if Thomas Paine had written a Common Sense a year earlier, nobody'd even remember it, and then somebody else might write it a year later, and it would be the one that catches on. So you can't really predict. Good question.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Thank you for this evening. I think I'm right in saying that a number of the founders had traveled internationally before the Declaration of Independence, and they hadn't seen any examples of republics. So was it that they'd seen things they didn't want and therefore had to find something else?
Well, I do think the best example I can think of what you're saying is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a very loyal British subject, very loyal. And he'd gone over to England, and he was the representative. He'd already made his fortune, considerable fortune, being a very innovative entrepreneur in Pennsylvania. And then he went over and was the agent for first Pennsylvania, but then 4 or 5 states. Everybody hires him because he's the best one. But what he observed in England, and he was already famous for his scientific work. He's already a world famous scientist. And that was sort of the key access to people in England. So he ended up having access to everyone. Yes, he became convinced over there that these English people would never treat Americans as equals. They never would. Washington had that experience when he was the colonel, which was the highest ranking person you could be in a colonial militia or army. And he was the troops of Virginia in the French and Indian War. But he couldn't get above colonel. And a colonel, even though the Virginia militia was critical, the state militias were critical to the British victory in North America in the 7 Years' War. Absolutely critical. But the highest rank they could have is a colonel. But as a colonel in any state militia, Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or whatever, you were automatically below every British officer, even a lieutenant. I mean, what are they thinking? We're equal with them. John Dickinson, when he writes his famous letter, when he writes his petition, this is Delaney. Delaney, who's the mayor of Annapolis, when he writes his petition, I can get to Dickinson because he says a similar thing. He says, don't you realize we are English people too? We are not, he used the word mulattoes. We're not half black. We're not half Native Americans. We are English people too. And we deserve the rights of Englishmen, and you're not giving them to us. And so they had this perception that they viewed these Americans as, subhuman, sort of intermixed, gone native, whatever. And we are people too. And we are British too. And we deserve the rights of British. So the idea that their experience, and Delaney had gone over and studied law, I believe, in the Inns of the Court. A lot of American lawyers went over and finished their law work over in England at that time because there were no law schools in America. And so, yeah, they went that experience and they said, we're people too. And their experience, we will always be treated as inferior by the Europeans because we are often the New World. And they didn't view themselves as that way. They viewed themselves as equal. And that's where I think all men are created equal is coming from. They viewed, we're the equal with you all.
Was there any attempt by Britain? Oh, sorry. Was there any attempt by Britain to clamp down on the ideas of common sense or attempt to stop the spread of the pamphlet?
Not really that. Certainly they clamped down, they tried to repress and counter the ideas that were circulating. The military would carry presses with them, and they would write alternative newspapers that they would pass around. There was definitely a propaganda effort. When Norfolk was burned, there was by British bombardments on January 1, 1776, part of what matters. The British would produce sort of papers that looked like the American papers with the name, like the same name, like the Norfolk Gazette, they both have, or Alexandria Gazette, and they would put a different spin on everything. They said, no, it wasn't our bombardment, the Americans burned their own city. And the Americans would say, the Virginians would say, no, the British bombed us and burned us. So yes, there was an effort to counter the viewpoint. But they were fascinated by common sense. Common Sense in its first year was published dozens of times. It was published, because there were no copyright laws there then. And it was published in, everywhere from, South Carolina, Boston, but it was also published widely in England, and it was widely read in England, and it was commented on it. One comment to that and to that sort of what you're referring to the Declaration of Independence was Samuel Johnson, and I hope I get this quote right. It's in a different book. Wrote, and he was, the person who wrote the dictionary. The first dictionary, Samuel Johnson, a very popular writer and well-known sort of man about town in London. He said, I wish all these pleas for liberty weren't coming from people who were driving, the word he's saying next, but we'll just say black people. That is coming from slaveholders. He sounded hypocritical because England didn't have slavery then. That, all these cries for liberty coming from the drivers of black people or the owners or the slaveholders. He was thinking of people like Jefferson. So yeah, there was an effort to counter. And certainly there was an effort to say, Washington will just become a next king. You're just fighting to exchange one King George for another. Revolutions always end in tyranny, and then they point to Julius Caesar. A few years later, they could point to, I guess, Napoleon. So yeah, there were efforts to counter, but the Patriots always seemed to have the upper hand with propaganda and with publications.
We have time for just one last question.
Okay. Would you say that your perspective on the American Revolution is akin to one of my college professors, Gordon Wood, in terms of how he stresses the radical nature of it.
It's a good question. Gordon Wood's a good friend of mine. He's endorsed other of my books. He didn't write a blurb for this one. I hope he likes it. He's written blurbs for me in the past. You know, in a way it was, in a way it's not. These people, when you look at the liberties they claim, so this is what I'd say, is if my argument is that most patriots didn't argue for independence before 1776. And I try to demonstrate it with a lot of examples. But they are calling for liberty. And they're clear on what liberties they think they should have as British citizens. When you look at 1776, now they want independence, but the liberties they call for haven't changed. They want the same liberties as before. So in that respect, no, it wasn't, I don't think it was radical in what they wanted. They wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They viewed that was their birthright as British citizens, and they weren't getting it, and they thought we can only get it by having our own governments. So it was radical in the sense of a new government, but it wasn't radical in the vision of what they wanted. And Gordon Woods argues, I think wrongly, for example, that every American knew slavery was wrong and think it was, I'm a little exaggerating, but not much, and think it was going to end. I don't think I think Americans, or I mean, we often hear Abigail Adams' famous letter in 1776 to John Adams, don't forget the women, give us women's rights, give us women's voting. But people forget his response. He said, and he loved his wife. He said, I laugh at your letter. We will never give up our masculine system. That's what he writes back. I quote it at greater length in the things. So no, that's not radical in their conception of what they want, but it is radical in the sense of how we get it. So I'd have to say I have a nuanced view on this with Gordon Woods, but I do know him quite well, and I hope he likes the book.
Well, I want to ask just one last question before some book signings, and thank you all for your questions. They've been stirring my thoughts about your book and 1776 too. And I want to come back to a question I have for you about sort of why you're writing this book now, besides the obvious answer of 2026. Maybe it is that obvious, but I'll circle back to that. It strikes me, thinking about, again, some of these questions and thinking about your answers throughout the evening and, of course, the book, that 1776 is what is in many ways exceptional about the year, to use a loaded term, is there is this distillation of ideas that had been circulating for a while. And there is a really formidable distillation of those ideas in writings such as Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. And then there is an acting on those ideas as well. So there's this, and it's possible that somebody maybe in the ether was going to distill those ideas at some point, to your question. But it's in this year in 1776 that people do distill them in really eloquent prose. And in many ways, since that time, we have been living in both the shadow of the sort of the splendor of those ideas or the aspirations of them, and also the shadow of how we have not lived up to them consistently at the time and in the intervening years. And I wonder, as a historian who has covered so many time periods in your work, and my introduction to Professor Larson's work was started in the 1920s, your book from the late 90s about the Scopes trial, wonderful book, slightly obsessed, as Professor Larson knows. it strikes me that, as a historian, is that sort of that battle since 1776, that battle of ideas that we've been engaged in since then, is that animating your pursuit of history through all of these years? Like, how do you, is this book for you? I know I'm throwing a lot at you, and you can throw a lot back at me, but as you've come to this book, you've arrived at 1776 after covering so many things. Is this a sort of distillation for you of an animating spirit that has been behind all of your other work? Like, what brought you here to this book?
I mean, it's a great question, and I haven't thought about it in that way, but yes, in a sense. I was brought to it because I wanted to wonder why we were approaching the 250th anniversary. I was alive and remember the 200th, and I wanted to know why it was important, because I really didn't think it was all about the battles, and I thought people would think mostly about the battles, and I'm more of an intellectual historian. And I do think I am I'll be honest, I'm a great fan of the American experiment. I do think it's an experiment. It's an ongoing experiment. And so I wanted to go back and try to recreate that year, because nobody had ever, in my opinion, no historian had ever tried to, everybody talks about the spirit of 1776, and nobody's ever really written about that year. There's a good book about why 1775 matters. You can look it up. There's a good book about why 1774 matters. You can look it up. And yet, why does 1776 matter? So I wanted to see, and what I found was, it wasn't the battles. I think Adams was right, at least for that year. It was the ideas, the animating ideas, and how they have continued to resonate down through American history. And I love your comment that, yeah, in a way that the Constitution doesn't. Sure, the preamble of the Constitution, in one place I differed with you, the preamble of the Constitution is lyrical, written by Gouverneur Morris, New Yorker. You made him a senator. But this document has been an animating document in the American dream, in the American experiment. And that I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence, but also all the ideas. It was, as he admitted to Adams, it was a distillation of what was coming out from many sources. It was a patchwork quilt. He just pulled together a lot of ideas. They were all out there already. The happiness bit, all those ideas were out there before. And they were the common currency of the previous 4 or 5 months. And so by focusing in on that year, yeah, I thought I see it as animating in American history. So I thought it was important to tell that story. So that's what I decided to do. And it turned out it may be timely in ways that I never expected when I started writing it. But what it shows is, yeah, we're a government. The goal of government should be the happiness of the people. And as said, as Tom Paine said, the will of the king is as much the law of the land in Britain as in France. In America, all capital letters, the law is king. For in an absolute government, the king is law. So in a free country, the law ought to be king. In the same way that John Adams wrote in Thoughts in Government, republics are governments of law, not of men. And those, yeah, I was dwelling on those. I didn't, anticipate whether it'd be particularly timely, but I think they're lessons for all time. I think that they're timely lessons, and it's an experiment. The contingency angle. It's an experiment every day that we have to keep reviving. This is, he closes his book, Tom Paine closes his experiment. This isn't for us, this is for all. What we're fighting for is for all of posterity. The cause of America is in great measure, he writes, the cause of America is the cause of all mankind. Those are noble sentiments. And it's not the typical story when a country becomes independent. It just splinters off. No, these people had when you talk about your phrase, American exceptionalism. These people thought they were doing something exceptional.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely reminder that this is an experiment, and it has been for 250 years that we are all participating in. And you have such a lovely way in your work and here of bringing the past to life. I thank you for that. I will also say this is the descendant of a Revolutionary War sergeant in our presence. So there is some.
One side and immigrants on the other.
There you go. Yeah, so there's just lots of history around us. And so thank you so much for your work. And thank you all, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.